Gee, you made it. Here you go, babe. Oh, hey, Henry. What? I'll wait for ya.
Sorry.
You doing all right?
All right, thanks. Nice to talk to you. So this is the same spot if you would like to. I mean, what do you think?
Hurry the long. It's going to be like Mr. DOD.
Everybody can take a seat, please. I call this meeting of the Yale Political Union to order. Is there perhaps an announcement from the chair of the Party of the Left? The announcement.
Last week, the Party of the Left debated resolve to don the tinfoil hat. We will. And this week, the Party of the Left will be having its vote of caucus.
Is there perhaps an announcement from the chair of the Progressive Party?
For the announcement.
The announcement.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Last week, the Progs met to debate resolve, go off the grid, and we will not. On this most terrible of midterm weeks, the Progs will be meeting tomorrow at 7:30 p.m. in the Trumbull room of Brantford College. Just kidding, we're meeting Wednesday. To debate resolve, do your readings. Hope to see you all there.
Is there an announcement from the chairman of the Independent Party?
For an announcement.
The announcement.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Last week, the Independent Party met to debate resolve to stop crimes before they happen. We will not. Wednesday at 7 p.m. in the Pearson Fellows Lounge, the Independent Party will be gathered to debate resolve relationships should be transactional. Hope to see you there.
Is there now an announcement from the chairman of the Federalist Party?
For an announcement.
The announcement.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Last week, the Federalist Party debated resolve immigrants should assimilate. They should. This week, the Federalist Party will be having a movie night.
Is there now an announcement from the chairman of the Conservative Party?
For an announcement.
The announcement.
Last week, the Conservative Party debated resolve that one should call a spade a spade. Apparently, we should. This week at 8:15 post meridian on Thursday at the William Frank Buckley Jr. Classic Memorial Hall and the Rimo Family Williams Sumner Class of 1863 debate floor at 34 Woodford Place, the Conservative Party will be toasted.
Is there now an announcement from the chairman of the Tory Party?
For an announcement.
The announcement.
Last week, the Tory Party met to debate resolve that technology has gone too far. It has not. This week, on Wednesday, the Tory Party will be meeting in the Saybrook Athenaeum Room at 7:30 to debate resolve federalism has failed us. I hope to see you all there.
Is there now an announcement from the chairman of the Party of the Right?
For announcement.
The announcement.
Last week, the Party of the Right met to debate resolve, learn that language. Of course we will. This Thursday, at the traditional hour of 8:15 post meridian at 348 Elm Street, the Party of the Right will be toasted.
Is there a final announcement from the president?
For an announcement.
The announcement.
Thank you, Madam.
Good evening, friends and guests. My name is Jean Wong, and I am the president of the Yale Political Union. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to the floor of the YPU. Founded in 1934, the YPU is the oldest and largest collegiate debate society in America. The union is a nonpartisan forum dedicated to encouraging spirited and substantive debate on matters of public interest, emphasizing the diversity of ideology and background. The union is also home to 7 constituent parties, each of which is distinct in character, history, and ideology. Each party debates weekly and hosts additional events. Each week, we invite renowned guests to engage and challenge our members. In our 88 years of history, we've had countless eminent thinkers, politicians, and heads of state join us for debate. Our members have gone on to become famous scholars, attorneys general, governors, senators, federal circuit judges, and secretaries of state. Our debates are usually free and open to the entire Yale community. Everyone, regardless of membership status, is welcome to attend. It is my honor to introduce our guest for tonight. Professor Adom Getachew is a political theorist and Neubauer assistant professor of political science at the College at the University of Chicago. She specializes in the intellectual and political histories of Africa and the Caribbean, and has research interests in history of political thought, theories of race and empire, and postcolonial political theory. Her book, Worldmaking After Empire, The Rise and Fall of Self-Determination, gives an account of self-determination in the political thought of Black Atlantic anticolonial nationalists during the height of decolonization in the 20th century. And with that, Madam Speaker, I move that we debate resolved and Western hegemony with Professor Adom Getachew.
Second. Hearing seconds, it is so moved. Is there perhaps the first speech affirmative from Professor Getachew? All right, speech, Ms. Getachew.
First, I just want to thank Madam Speaker and Madam Secretary for having me here, and I want to thank all of you for being here. Before arguing in favor of the position and Western hegemony, I'd like to define the term Western hegemony. Most obviously, Western hegemony, or the idea of hegemony, refers to political, economic, and military dominance. By the West, we mean the United States and Western Europe. So this kind of dominance we can associate with various features of our contemporary world order. For instance, constituting less than 5% of the world's population, America earns 24% of the world's total income. The European Union, with the third largest economy in the world, represents another 15% of the world's total income. These powers also set the rules of the international game. They're overrepresented in decision-making bodies, such as the Security Council, the World Trade Organization, the World Bank, and so forth. But importantly, hegemony is not just coercion or the power to coerce. It involves structures and institutions of legitimation, which co-opt and persuade weaker actors and subalterns of the status quo order. So hegemons then, as I've said, they set the rules of the game. These are rules that enable the expansion of a hegemonic order. They ideologically legitimate that order. They co-opt elites from peripheral states and absorb counter-hegemonic ideas. Western academic and cultural institutions, such as the one we are in today, also help to shape the terms of the debate, making the ideas available in places like these the most dominant ones. Again, importantly, this is not about force. Most of the best institutions of higher education are still in the United States. Universities like this one train the leaders of the world. That's why people like me from other countries come here as well. But this does mean that, as economists Ndongo Sambasila and Daniela Gabor have argued, that the fact that most of the leaders of the world are trained in places like this means only certain ideas are reproduced, right, and produced and reproduced. So most finance ministers and other economic decision makers of the periphery attend a select few economics departments and business schools in the US and in Europe, reproducing a set of status quo ideas about development, trade, and the relationship between the state and the economy. This would be quite distinct. This dominance in the contemporary post-Cold War period is quite different from an earlier moment of the Cold War, for instance, where third world actors could go to the Soviet Union, where they studied Scandinavian models, and so forth, thinking with and imagining a diverse range of models for their own societies. Today I would like to present 3 arguments in support of the resolution and Western hegemony. The first one we can take to be a Republican, small r Republican, or social democratic argument. So my first argument is that Western hegemony undermines democratic or Republican government at home. As citizens and residents of the richest and most powerful state in the world, why would it be in our best interest to end the system of hegemony which seems to benefit us? I would argue that the costs are much larger for us than we think, and that the benefits accrue to very few of our citizens. Consider, for example, the financial cost of the United States playing the self-appointed role of policeman of the world. According to research with the Costs of War program at Brown University, the post-9/11 wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Syria, and elsewhere have cost the United States $8 trillion. The United States accounts for 38% of global military spending and allocates 1/6 of its budget to the Defense Department. In 1953, President Dwight Eisenhower said, "Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies in the final instance a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and those who are not clothed." To be sure, the military has historically been a major source of employment through defense contracts. It has also served as a model of racial integration. So let's stick with the example of the US as a policeman of the world. Let's examine the war on terrorists, erosions of democracy at home. First, the war on terror empowered the executive as it usurped congressional power to declare war. You will note that for many years, for most of your whole lives actually, we were in a war that was never declared by Congress. The war on terror also expanded and empowered the national security state, which is not transparent and not accountable to the public. Many of you might have been too young, but you'll remember that the early days of the war on terror were overshadowed by debates over the Patriot Act and the secret expansion of a surveillance program that implicated many US citizens as well as so-called terrorists. Finally, the expansion of the war on terror and US power in the world has enmeshed police powers domestically and internationally. We see this in the acceleration of the militarization of our local polices. We see it in the ways that counterinsurgency has become a central feature and top priority of local police forces. We see it in the ways in which border control and external power has been delegated to local and domestic police forces. So we too are subjects of the power we wield at abroad. My second argument is an anti-imperial argument. And I would argue that Western hegemony is incompatible with the broad normative commitments to anti-imperialism that emerged after World War II. This commitment was twofold. In light of the ravages of Nazism and the Holocaust, there was a broad view that the justification and legitimation of white supremacy, which of course underwrote Nazism, but also underwrote the history of European expansion around the world, could no longer be a legitimate basis of claiming power on the world stage. So this was a normative critique of a kind of justification of white supremacy, but also the superiority of Western civilization. There was also a kind of political component of this, which was that the right to self-determination, namely that all peoples should have the rights to govern themselves, became a universal norm in this period. So now, of course, Western hegemony in this moment does not take the form of large territorial empires that dominated the 19th and 20th century, but contemporary Western hegemony is intimately connected to that history in 3 respects. First, contemporary Western hegemony is a historical product of the long history of European imperial expansion. This is not just an argument of the left. Consider former French representative to the UN and a fellow at the Brookings Institute, Jean-David Levitt, who says, Western dominance began in the 16th and 17th century, the century of the great discoveries and colonizations, he doesn't say that, of Spain and Portugal. Western dominance continued with the 18th century, and when it was associated with France, then the 19th century, which was ultimately, undoubtedly that of the United Kingdom, and finally the 20th century, when the US took the baton from Europe to affirm our Western values. He argues 1991, the end of the Cold War, is the pinnacle of 4 centuries of Western reign of the world. So he himself traces a long history of continuity between contemporary Western hegemony and European imperialism before. Now again, of course, as I said, formal empire is no longer the world in which we live in. But the experiences of that period of unequal economic and political integration of the world continue to reverberate in the present. Economic development, as we know, has proven challenging for formerly colonized countries. Having been formed by empires into raw material export zones, they began with little industrial or technological capacity. And to generate, to acquire that technological capacity, they had to produce more surplus of the cocoa, coffee, tea, lumber, rice, rubber, or bauxite they were forced to produce in the first place. Stuck at the bottom of the value chain with only cheap things to sell, their only hope for development was to borrow from the wealthy countries. And this has only created a series of death traps, we might say. So that's argument 1 under anti-imperialism. The second is that while older languages of a standard of civilization have been largely vanquished from our own vocabulary, the argument for Western dominance implicitly and explicitly relies on a claim of the superiority of the West, based on the view that it is the birthplace of a distinct but universal set of values, including freedom and democracy. For example, the European Union has what it calls a neighborhood policy, which commits North African and Middle Eastern states to a series of economic and political reforms. The Union justifies its special role in the region on 3 grounds. First, the Union is a model of liberty, democracy, and peace that it can export to its neighbors. Second, the EU has produced a tradition of supporting countries in transition from autocracy to democracy based on their experience in Eastern Europe. Third, the EU has a special responsibility for protecting and promoting core norms and values of the world. Former President of the European Council, Herman Van Rompuy, put it this way: our values are at stake: democracy, the rule of law, the freedom of peaceful expression. These countries are our neighbors, and we can see them from the coastline. As Europeans, then, we have a special responsibility here, in a way going beyond a normal international responsibility. Inserting Europe as central to the future of the region, he would go on to argue, and this was in 2011, without Europe, there would still have been an Arab Spring, but without us, there will be no Arab summer. Third, the persistence of Western hegemony undermines self-rule and self-determination by limiting the choice set available to less powerful states. I've already talked a little bit about the debt traps in which postcolonial states found themselves. In the kind of high point of the debt crisis in the Third World in the 1980s, there emerged what was called the Washington Consensus, which forced fiscal and monetary austerity, liberalization of trade, and privatization of public enterprises onto Third World states as a condition of policy was the unilateralism with which the policies were instituted and the ways in which post-colonial states had no power to shape those terms. I now move to my third argument in support of the resolution and Western hegemony. and this is what I would call the internationalist argument. I argue that the persistence of Western hegemony makes the prospect of identifying genuinely global solutions to global problems difficult. Whether the external threat, whether we're talking about the existential threat of climate change, the global crisis and decline of democracy, or the recent COVID-19 pandemic, responding to border-defying threats and crises such as these requires learning from and thinking with the rest of the world, rather than viewing the rest of the world as simply the site where ideas developed by the West are applied and extended. Let's take the recent experience of COVID-19 as an example we all know well. Of the 2,000 clinical trials related to COVID-19, 90% were conducted in wealthy nations. China and India accounted for most of the rest. Beyond COVID-19, only 2% of all vaccine trials take place in Africa. So this is not just a matter of representation. Clinical trials in a diversity of settings ensure that drugs and vaccines are globally effective. Neglecting poor countries in medical research also ensures that questions specific to those contexts, such as how best to prevent community spread in urban slums, how to reach people in rural areas where many of the world's population still live, go unanswered. Finding and supporting this kind of research can be a way of expanding local capacity and expertise urgently needed to combat infectious diseases. And of course, ultimately, we will never eradicate a disease as long as we only do so in a very small part of the world, right? So we have to be able to engage in knowledge production that includes as much of the world and understands those as representatives of the wider world. But this is not just about scientific research. You might have not noticed, but for the first year, or maybe the whole entire pandemic, there were frequent articles in the New York Times, The Guardian, and other outlets orbiting around the question, why aren't more Africans dying of COVID-19? And these articles inevitably pointed to the lack of state counting, the inability, somehow Africans were dying in great numbers, but no one could actually know. As the Kenyan political scientist Nanjala Nyambola has argued, this fails to ask the right kinds of questions that can contribute to moving humanity towards a greater understanding of our shared circumstances. Instead of asking why aren't more Africans dying, which necessarily assumes that they should have been dying at greater numbers, we might have asked different kinds of questions. For instance, we might have probed how differentiated structures of social care for the elderly, the highly institutionalized forms that we have in the United States and Europe, versus the kin-based forms of social care available in Africa, might have produced lower death rates for the elderly in African contexts. We might have thought about how urbanization, much more, of course, dominant in Western countries, created specific kinds of vulnerabilities that enabled the forms of community spread we saw in New York and elsewhere, but didn't happen in Africa, right, in the same levels, or did in various levels. So places with higher levels of urbanization, South Africa, for instance, did have higher rates of the disease. So such kinds of questions break from the exceptionalizing and pathologizing of the rest, particularly Africa, but of the rest of the world, to ask what might the African experience, or what might the experience of the global South teach us about the limits of our own societies. And this last point, of course, speaks to the very heart of the kind of institution we're in now. To argue in the affirmative end Western hegemony at a Yale University or at the University of Chicago is to also demand that we produce a different kind of knowledge, with non-local relevance, but they can be the sites to teach us new things about our world. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank the guest for a most informative speech. I'm still a little curious personally as to what ending Western hegemony looks like in action. And to kind of orient this in particular, it seems like a lot of the issues that the guest discusses relate to the issues of capitalism and the control that capitalism centered around the West has over these non-Western countries. So is there a way to end Western hegemony without also dismantling capitalism?
My own argument would be ultimately that ending Western hegemony would also mean ending a capitalist world order. And I think it would also mean, that would mean ultimately, as putting the three arguments together that I have made, right? Or a democratic argument, a social democratic, domestic argument from the perspective of those of us who live in the world's hegemon, right? An anti-imperial argument, an internationalist argument. It also means that the kind of question of how to dismantle Western hegemony depends on building alliances between domestic social and political movements and their international counterparts, right? Around a shared agenda of what a meaningful forms of political and economic equality will look like.
Further questions for Professor Getachew, Mr. Tan.
Thank you. I really do appreciate Oh, yes. Thank you. Yeah, I do appreciate the speech lady, and I agree very much with her critiques of the existing order. I'm just curious if the lady has kept out the sound on cultural hegemony, because I can very much think of how the insidious effect of Western cultural dominance in countries like mine that have that are escaping the shadow of Western colonialism. Does the lady agree that ending Western hegemony should also encompass ending Western cultural hegemony? And if so, what might that look like?
I think this is a very interesting, interesting and important question. So, on the one hand, in some ways, where I ended is connected to the question of cultural hegemony, right? We would want to build a world in which the contributions of various communities to the kind of culture of the humanity is recognized, respected, and understood, right? I think there is, what's interesting to me is, say I'm from East Africa. I spent some time there and other parts of the African continent. And one of the things that's very striking is that the proliferation of various forms of social media have actually meant that, in some ways, Western cultural hegemony is being undermined. Not always in service of local cultures, right? It means, my family spends a lot of time watching Turkish soap operas, for instance, or Indian or Bollywood movies, right? But it also means that as a member of the diaspora, I can sit in the United States and watch any Ethiopian show I want to watch or listen to Ethiopian music, right? So I think in some ways, on the cultural question, the West no longer has the kinds of cultural hegemony it once enjoyed. And I would also say, I think this question about cultural hegemony, it sometimes, it varies regionally in the world, but I think it's also particularly important in the United States or countries which are internally diverse, right? Because the demands for representation of minority communities and cultures within the West is connected to that question of dismantling a cultural hegemony.
Further questions for Professor Getachew, Mix Dunn.
I'm interested in if Ms. Getachew has concerns about the potential emergence of a new alternative hegemony emerging after the it would perhaps be a more internationalist one, but is that a hegemony that still should be feared? Or are we just okay with an internationalist hegemony, or is there a way to do that?
One of the things that's interesting about debating this resolution in this moment, right, is I do think Western hegemony is ending. Or at least it's in crisis. terms of legitimation are certainly in crisis, right? The ways it was held together ideologically and institutionally are in severe crisis. There are challenges, right? Major counter-hegemonic challenges, China, Russia, in the contemporary moment. And I do not think, right, a world of a China-centered world order or a Russian-centered world order or a return of a kind of Cold War-like situation is necessarily going to be better for the parts of the world I do think one of the things you can say about the early version of the Cold War, or the first Cold War 1.0, I don't know what 2.0 will look like, is that form of contestation, that there wasn't one hegemon, did create more bargaining room and opportunity for smaller states and regional powers. And so, at the same time, and we're already beginning to see this, right? A Cold War structure is ramping up military spending, et cetera. So it's entrenching the kinds of things I was talking about in point one. So I feel ambivalent, let's say, about the actual way we're exiting Western hegemony, which is into this world of competing hegemons.
Further questions? The chairman of the Party of the Right.
There's something that's constantly puzzling about this perspective that people like the guest put forward, that how is national sovereignty and self-determination compatible with increased global governance? Historically, this all looked like struts on the ground in the countries that insisted on third-world nationalism. The amount of ethnic conflicts that occurred around the world after decolonization, I will not need to remind people here.
Well, I wrote a book about this. So I would say that the argument I made in the book about why this isn't true for every part of the third world, but nationalists in the parts of the world I wrote about in Africa and the Caribbean did argue for forms of global governance. One, constitutions of Ghana, Guinea, and Mali, the first constitutions of those three African states, said they would abrogate sovereignty to a federation upon the creation of a regional federation. In the West Indies, a regional federation was created for 4 years. And the argument for why it was that national independence required rethinking international institutions, including creating forms of regional and global governance that did delimit sovereignty, was that national independence in a world of unequal economic and global power was never going to create the conditions for the forms of self-determination people really wanted. So that, in fact, it would be the combination of nation building and what I called world making, right? The transformation of international and regional institutions that would create the conditions for meaningful forms of independence and ability to rule oneself. I think the question of, so that's the question of how a kind of argument for national independence and international interdependence went together, or how people argued for it and tried to realize that vision of the world. I think the second part of your question is about what happens to the internal practices of the nation, right? The kind of processes of fragmentation and violence that happen within postcolonial states. I think that's a really interesting kind of question. And I would argue there, too, that experiments in the early part of the postcolonial period attempted to have various forms of decentralized federation, right? Where there would be meaningful forms of local autonomy and self-rule for ethnic and religious minorities. Now, I think the pressure of external independence, the attempt to secure one's sovereignty on the international stage, and these experiments of decentralization within ended up being incompatible with each other. And ultimately, states pursued the kind of claim of external independence, especially as the conditions of economic inequality and political inequality grew more pronounced.
Further questions for Professor Getachew? Is that Mr. Sagal?
Mr. Sagal.
Remarks. I have a question about the ability for states not in the West with rules-based international order. I think that's something we think very strongly about with Ukraine, and we see a lot of countries taking non-aligned stances or pro-Russian stances, like whatever the populations of their country might actually believe in. But in a world in which we want a rules-based international system, would the speaker believe that Western hegemony is a means to that end?
I do not believe Western hegemony is a means to the end of a rules-based international order, because I think it is important to remember that the conditions for violating and undermining the rule-based international order were initiated, extended, exacerbated by the United States. There were the wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, the war on terror was not based on the rules of the international order, right? The various other forms of intervention that the United States has been engaged in, most extensively in the post-Cold War period, but also, before that, were not, compatible with a rules-based international order. So the undermining of the rules of the international order are not simply being created by states we think of as outside of the West or, as competitors to the West. But, again, the conditions of that undermining were generated from within the kind of, at least initially, the initiators of that rules-based international order, right? I think, yes, you're right that insofar as we will continue to live for the foreseeable future in a world of nation states, we do need rules and structures that delimit what nations can do. The Ukrainian, I just want to be clear, I'm not arguing that the United States is the responsible or culpable for what Russia is doing in the Ukraine, right? Russia has violated what are universally recognized as the rules of the international order: sovereign equality, territorial integrity, non-intervention. But that these words, sovereign equality, non-intervention, and territorial integrity, no longer mean anything, can no longer serve as a foundation and bulwark against that form of, violence. Those have already, the conditions for their irrelevance were already created by the kind of undermining of that international order by the United States.
A penultimate question for Professor Getachew, Mr. G.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thanks, Braxton. So the lady points out that she is a supporter of the democratic, small Republican, and liberalism that has pervaded the past few decades, but also points out that many of these values and human rights are a Western construct being pushed onto other countries. So considering that the alternatives to Western hegemony tend to be more liberal and don't believe in these values, how can a human rights framework or even a democratic framework survive a post-Western world?
It's, one might argue, right, and I would be willing to concede this, right, that the ideas we associate with modernity, democracy, the rights-bearing subject, the liberal subject, right, were incubated, imagined, theorized in the West by Westerners. But two things about that, right? One, the kind of theorists and we imagine as the kind of foundational figures who theorized those concepts, Tocqueville, Mill, right, did so in the context and with the background of European global expansion, right? So one, there were ways in which their ideas were never solely a kind of parochial exercises about what was going to happen in France or America, right? But they always were thinking about the rest of the world, right? And they were trying to make also, in various ways, the project of European imperial expansion compatible with their ideas, or at times they were critical of them, right? So the world was always part of European self-imagination, right? The ideas were not, they were incubated by Westerners, but in relation to a world. They needed the world to think those thoughts. That's one. Two, once those ideas came into the world, right, they were taken up and transformed and reiterated in various different registers, right? So now it is true that almost everywhere there is social protest in the world, people will use the language of rights, people will use the language of democracy, right? Those are the terms of justice and freedom for people around the world, right? But the idea of rights, for instance, in the course of the 20th century, accrued economic and social meanings that were not part of the initial liberal imagination of rights. And third world states, including in collaboration with the Soviet Union, played a really important role in making the claim that economic rights have to be as important as political rights, right? Similarly, with the idea of democracy, I was telling a few students earlier that, in places like India and South Africa, local forms of self-determination are much more important. People are much more interested in participating in elections and engaging in local self-government than they are in national politics, right? So what democracy means to us in America, what it means in post-apartheid South Africa, may not be exactly the same thing, right? So we have to think about the ways in which these ideas take on new life and new meanings elsewhere. And by understanding those new lives and meanings elsewhere, we might be able to think ourselves out of the various crises our own concepts are in our home.
And for a final question, Ms. Papadimitrios.
Thank you so much, Madam Speaker. Thank you. So to build on the lady's answer to the previous question a little bit, is she also making a kind of counter-historical argument? Like, is Western hegemony now bad because it has run its course, or because it should never have existed? Is it worth it for the things that we got from it?
I would not want to say that it's worth it for what we got out of it. Like, did we need, the transatlantic slave trade? Did we need the genocide of indigenous people across the Americas? Like, I'm not willing to concede that the death and destruction of countless, people, but also forms of social life around the world was worth it, so that we could have a theory of freedom. I don't know what our world would have been like had it not been, structured by Western hegemony. I don't know if it would have been a better or a worse world, right? I can't tell you that because it's but I personally would not say, standing here today, that it was all worth it.
And with that, Professor Getachew is heartily thanked. Is there now a first speech in the negative?
First speech.
The speech.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and can I thank the guest once again for taking the time to join us. I'd like to begin by saying that I'm actually very sympathetic to many things that the guest has written about in her book. In particular, I do agree that theorists of the decolonial era and theorists of the post-colonial world should be rejecting this basic and simplistic dichotomy between nation state and empire, and should be seriously engaging with the multiple, as the guest said in her speech earlier, diverse range of alternatives that that post-colonial actors and activists were really thinking about in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. And while I do deeply appreciate her contribution to this subject in her field and more broadly, it is also precisely in consideration of these alternatives to the imperial model that I disagree with the guest. I'm particularly interested in what some people call the federal moment, or this idea of a federal system, which the guest alluded to briefly in one of the answers to her questions. A federal system that would have incorporated the former colonies, colonial subjects, as well as the metropole, which, as the guest noted, had been tried in the West Indies as well as within the French West African context. there were debates across the colonial world as to whether these federations were just a way of reconfiguring empire, or whether they were actually whether they actually constituted the culmination of the decolonial process. In the guest's framework, this post-colonial emancipation requires an internationalist political project to fulfill its potential. And for the protagonists of her story, meaningful emancipation from imperial domination required a wholesale rethinking of the political coordinates of the relevant space. And this is, again, where I disagree with the guest. For me, we cannot have a one-size-fits-all approach to the post-colonial era. And importantly, there are other post-colonial states that would likely have benefited from the preservation of imperial sovereignty, with its multiple layers and varying degrees of autonomy that guarantee pluralism and that serve as a bulwark against the ethnic majoritarianism, and in many cases, violence that has tainted the decolonial project until this day. And when I say imperial sovereignty, I'm not referring to imperial governance, I'm not referring to the very brutal extraction of resources and forced labor, but I'm referring to what Lauren Benton here at Yale has written extensively about as this multi-layered form of sovereignty at which there are multiple layers of control, and at many levels, self-governance and autonomy on the part of colonial and imperial subjects. And so I think in critiquing Western hegemony, regional particularism is particularly important. The guest has written extensively about the Caribbean and West Africa, but I think we can see a very different case study if we think about South Asia and India in particular. Because in West Africa, because in the Caribbean specifically, the colonial present was already a site of rupture infused with this radical post-colonial futurism. It was in the Caribbean context, the vast majority of people, except for the white minority, had been transported there forcefully either through indentureship or slavery. But in the South Asian context, the imperial forms of sovereignty were already the norm. And Sir Christopher Bailey, in his groundbreaking book on Indian social communication and networks in pre-colonial and early colonial India, has argued, quote, that the British knowledge about India was not simply a unilateral construction of categories of difference in pursuit of global domination, but was a far messier product shaped not just by British imperial interests, but also the inputs and aspirations of indigenous communities. And who did the British Empire encounter when they went to India? They encountered the Mughal Empire, which, besides being one of the best places to probably have been born as a human being, was also one of the empires in history that had a radically accommodating approach in managing difference, with the Emperor Akbar famously positioning himself as this universal sovereign, upon whose sovereignty Muslims, Hindus, Sikhs, and Christians alike could harmoniously live together in what he called sulh-e-kul, which in Persian means harmonious peace. Fast forward to the 20th century, what is the subcontinent like? It is broken after a violent partition. It's fractured. After a violent partition, we see one of the most egregious refugee crises in history. And this was because spineless colonial administrators kowtowed to ethno-religious nationalists who were expediting and calling for this rapid end to Western hegemony. There were many other alternatives available, especially if they had looked to their own past. And the formation of Pakistan and Bangladesh, for instance, was purely a product of this romantic ethno-religious nationalism.
I move that we grant Mr. Gupta another 30 seconds to wrap up his speech.
30 seconds, he's granted 30 more seconds.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Importantly, the subcontinent is the way that it is today, with tensions between Hindus and Muslims, which again is a problematic binary, and violence between the two ethnic groups at an all-time low. And this is precisely because the ultimate colonial plan for the post-independence India kowtowed to the language of self-determination and sovereignty, when they had other feasible alternatives that could have preserved the harmonious imperial sovereignty that was also an aspect of pre-colonial India. We must look to the past, to the Mughal Empire, and to Qing China, and to go with the tried and tested rather than the untested and the utopian.
Question for Mr. Panya Gupta, the question from the guest.
Great, thank you for that speech. I have been writing a lot about imperial sovereignty, and in the British Empire in particular in the early 20th century, and actually about Indian subjects as well as African subjects demanding equality in the empire. And I write about a period in particular where, you know, the empire was being split between self-governing parts of the British Empire, Canada, Australia, which had self-government, and which were then limiting the mobility rights of the Indian subjects. So my question is, how is the kind of imperial, pluralistic imperial sovereignty compatible? Can it be compatible with democratic self-government? What would that compatibility look like?
Sure, and thank you very much for that question. When I turned to this plan that was considered briefly by Nehru, Gandhi, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, and Clement Attlee at the time, which was called the Cabinet Mission Plan, which would have allowed for India to be a part of a much more loosely confederated a dominion with a loose confederation with multiple sovereignties. They sort of divided the subcontinent up into Part A, B, and C states, in which Part A would have direct control, the British would have the central government would have direct control, while in the Part B and C states, various local actors and princely states, for example, would be able to assert their own kinds of local sovereignty. I think that there are many historical precedents for democratic governance within this framework. As the guest said herself in a response to an earlier question, democracy in many of these post-colonial societies does have precedents that don't exactly mesh with the Western view. In India, for example, there's the panchayat system, in which local councils manage local governance, and this was very much the case throughout many areas of India during the British period. And I think it would have been the case too had the subcontinent been confederated in a kind of loose imperial federation that the Cabinet Mission Plan of 1946 would have allowed for.
Further questions from Mr. Panyagupta, Mr. Trujillo.
Is this not, though, just an even more radical call for ending Western hegemony? Is the problem with countries like India not precisely that it imported bad ideas like ethno-nationalism and communism from the West?
I don't think it's a radical call for that at all. If anything, the main thing that I was trying to say in my speech was that imperial forms of sovereignty and pre-colonial forms of sovereignty in certain colonial states are actually more similar than we think, and that. But I do agree with the gentleman in that ethno-nationalism was important to the subcontinent and led to and arguably is responsible for much of the ethnic violence that we see today. But I don't think that. But I don't think it's right to deem what I was talking about a call for an end to Western hegemony at all. Rather, it's actually acknowledging that Western imperial sovereign norms can coexist with pre-colonial or indigenous norms.
Thank you for indulgence, Madam Speaker. So, Mr. Panyagupta laid out a weaker form of sovereignty with, what best described it seems like federalism to some level on the global level. But I'm curious about this weakening of national sovereignty and its ability for stronger actors to exploit weaker ones. It feels that the weak sovereignty of the 19th, 18th century is what allowed the West to exploit these weaker powers. My mind comes to China and India in particular for Western powers moving in. So in a world in which we weaken into a close post-national state, how do we prevent stronger actors from exploiting the ones who are decentralized?
I think in general people should be more comfortable with places being totally ungoverned. And that can exist within an imperial framework. Look at Burma in the modern day, for instance. I think that is an example of a country that brands itself as this federalist structure and that has many civil wars going on at the present moment. But those conflicts have not spilled over into neighboring countries because it is contained within this weak, albeit workable, framework of sovereignty.
And with that, Mr. Panyagupta is heartily thanked. And now a second speech in the affirmative from Mr. Agarwal. The speech.
I'm not entirely. My point is slightly more niche, so I might speak fairly briefly and there's interesting questions. I remember last semester I was taking a history seminar on the environmental history of North America. And one day the conversation turned to Columbus. And one of the students recalled the story of how when Columbus first came to Hispaniola, there was a group of people on the beach, and he told them that that night he would block out the sun, and miraculously, when the sun disappeared, they were shocked, right, and owed them their allegiance. And the student mentioned that. I noticed that we default to this language very often. Later in that same class, the topic of Cortez's conquest of Mexico City arose. And everyone had this tendency to talk about the way that the Spanish dominated indigenous groups, even though in that specific case, that distinction isn't necessarily the most relevant one because many of the non-Mexica groups were instrumental in overthrowing Tenochtitlan because they saw their own interests as aligned with that of the Spanish. In that same class, a few weeks later, I remember reading about the Abenikian English conceptions of animals. And going into the class, I think all of us assumed that we'd all heard the narrative that the English view animals through this material lens, right? They hunt for sport. And Native Americans, by contrast, are these primeval stewards of nature, right? And they never view the animal with any purpose other than their own survival, right? It's this very kind of fundamental binary. But instead, what happens is you read these old English stories of the rabbit and the superstitions surrounding animals, and you read Abenican mythology, and you realize that there are all really fundamental differences. There are also a lot of similarities, but these similarities are overlooked when the narrative that's put in place is that there are these two civilizations, the Western and the non-Western. And when we discuss the Western, we want to emphasize its proximity to what we consider Western values. And with the non-Western, it's viewed purely from its distance from the West, right, which leads to that material and material economy. And so at first glance, we might think, okay, the terms we use in common parlance are not entirely precise, that's not really new. The first is that rather than purely being reductive, it's fundamentally racialized, right? There's this idea that there's this fundamental difference between white countries and white adjacent countries and non-white countries, right? So a concept like democracy or Christianity starts in a very specific place, and now is on all 7 continents. And this is a multi-century process of diffusion. But as soon as it crosses from Europe to outside of Europe, it leaves its home, right? What was an internal process has become an external process. And so this concept is not unique to Europe, right? Christianity didn't start in Poland, right? It didn't end in Europe. It's somehow labeled as Western. Another casualty of the West non-West dichotomy is that it assumes that the West is always the main character. I was listening to Gupta's speech before, and he was talking about India, right? The legacy of partition, the way that we talk about religious conflict in India today. And in many of my conversations at Yale, whenever people talk about partition or religious tension in India, they always start with the British. They always start with the idea that the British divided India, they left it in tatters, and everything is kind of resulted in that. Rather than acknowledging the role that Indians themselves played in partition, as Mr. mentioned, right? The fact that there was this existing interest in nationalism and antagonists within the Muslim community. And fundamentally, the story that 20th century India was broken by the British is actually the same story as 19th century India being uplifted by the British. They have different moral colorings, but they have the same main character, and so they're just as Western-centric. And so to conclude, one might ask, what is the solution, right? What is my point? And I think what we need is part 2 of this idea.
Is there a motion?
For motion.
The motion is for Gola.
Thank you. I move we extend the gentleman's time by 30 seconds.
Second. 30 seconds, his time is so extended.
Right, that 30, 40 years ago, in his own very pretentious, verbose way, Edward Said took this concept of Orientalism in the way that Europeans viewed, particularly the Middle East, but Asia overall, and deconstructed all these kind of exoticizing assumptions that they made. And I think we need to follow up to that. We need Occidentalism, right? We need to realize that our concept of the West creates this cultural binding that doesn't reflect reality, and is really, we're unable to disconnect from it. So.
Question for Mr. Agarwal.
what is the relationship with that, between that epistemic project and the kind of material project? Like, just how do you see that relationship, basically?
I mean, I think they both have to be somewhat utilitarian, right? Sometimes epistemic decolonization can be a reverse of epistemic colonization because there's a kind of purism to it, right? That one assumes that. I know, like, I was just reading Neubauer once longer, right? He's like a Kenyan author. And he had this really radical shift in his life where he stopped writing English entirely, and he starts writing in Kikuyu, which is very long for me. Maybe the Kikuyu is better than the English version. But I remember thinking at the time that in making that transition, he started writing in language that the vast majority of Kenyans don't speak, right? And it's like, everyone's reading English anyway. And so yeah, I think that to the extent that people need to epistemically decolonize, it's not removing everything that came from the West, but removing the assumptions, removing the frameworks that came from the West in order to evaluate them on terms.
I actually like the gentleman's critique of this kind of like narrative hegemony that we have. I'm wondering how real of an issue he thinks this is right now. Like, it seems like if I want to learn about the history of my own country, I can like do so freely via the internet. And, like, yes, like a majority of my sources might be Western, but that's just because, like, frankly, those are the sources that are left because the majority of the other ones have been lost to the times. Like, does he think that like this is an issue that is as present like right now as opposed to like when people had to read history with books?
One is the issues like that I'm talking about at Yale, like the way people frame historical debates do this dichotomy of the West versus the non-West. And I think that's present, I think, purely because I've observed it, right? Because even though I think at the university level we resist that, and our discourse is much more nuanced, the kind of modern education system discourse that one grows up with, in the US at least, emphasizes that dichotomy so much that it's going to be great to us. But I think if anything, it exists much more problematically outside the West. I remember going to a bookstore a couple years ago in Delhi and looking at these Hindu rabbits. And I'm in India and I'm reading these Hindu books. And in the copy of the Bhagavad Gita I was looking at was covered in these quotes from famous white people, right? It's like J. Robert Oppenheimer. I read Sanskrit every day, right? Albert Einstein, right? This is a great book. And it's this bizarre phenomenon where in one's own country, one's own culture is only relevant because of its connection to the West. So I don't know if that answers the question, but like, I definitely think a lot of these divisions are still very prominent and need to be deconstructed.
A final question for Mr. Agarwal. Seeing none, he is so very, very thanked. Is there now a second speech in the negative?
So, in 2017, 2 pieces of art were sold across the world from each other. One in China, sad. So, in 2017, 2 pieces of art were sold across the world from each other. One was sold in China, it's Wu Bin's 10 Views of the Lingbi Rock. And the other was sold in the West, and it was Salvator Mundi, Leonardo da Vinci's famous portrait of Christ. I think these 2 paintings get at some of the key differences between the Western tradition and the Chinese tradition. The Chinese tradition is very obsessed with this depersonified form of beauty, the beauty that you can find in peace, in tranquility, and in nature. Whereas the Western tradition tends to be much more obsessed with the strength of the individual. And you can compare this as well in a lot of religious texts. And I think that there's a degree to which it's quite striking when you look at statues of Christ, that Christ is often depicted with huge muscles, whereas statues of the Buddha are often depicted as gaunt due to his rejection of the material food. And I think this is where you get at one of the key tenets of the Western tradition that exported across the world has actually led to a lot of good. And why I think Western hegemony, while being very far from perfect, is going to be a hell of a lot better than any of the practical alternatives.
And this basically comes down to really the focus on the individual as opposed to the communal. The focus on the individual, which goes throughout Western text, is something that has allowed for freedom movements across the world. And I don't think that it's any coincidence that Martin Luther King actually says among his top books that you should all go out and read are things like Summa Theologica by Thomas Aquinas. There are things like the Bible, there are things like the Nicomachean Ethics. All things which tend to focus a little bit on your individual agency to do good, as opposed to the communal agency to actually go out there and, create a better society. And while I'm increasingly somewhat in favor of the latter, I think that it's important to understand that it would be bizarre if we were to take the role of the individual as nil. Because this is what creates tyranny. This is what creates despotism. And I think that it's no coincidence that the greatest spreader of basically non-extremely centralized imperial forms of government in the long run, rather than saying Western states, I would say is the Western canon. It's the Western tradition. And I understand that there's quite a lot of disagreement in this room. And I hope to get this more in questions, but I would like someone to genuinely challenge me and tell me why it is, not that democracy, but that a strong view of liberal rights emerges in the West. I would like someone in this room to get at me and tell me why it is not the case that you have a strong view of individual agency. I want to know, why does Martin Luther King recommend we read the Nicomachean Ethics? Why Aristotle? Why Thomas Aquinas? It's really because the key to movements like this is found in these Western texts, in the idea of the glory of every individual as opposed to the communal agency. And with that,
The question from Mr. Paduli, the guest.
Okay, thank you for the speech. I would like to also remind the speaker that Martin Luther King also said his country was the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. I have two questions for you. One is whether we want to reduce the long history of the Western canon to an argument about the priority and privilege of the individual. Surveying quite a range of texts, from the Nicomachean Ethics to the Bible and so forth. Is that really the message of that long tradition? That's one question. The second question is, how might we think about what Martin Luther King's role and relationship to that tradition is?
So I think that the Western canon is very difficult to define. It's not really a history, but I think that kind of stemming from that, you have to look at the pieces which are really having the longest lasting effects. And I think that the works which do tend to be ones which have a focus on individualism, whether in a good way or in some ways with worse consequences. I do think that fascism is a consequence of the Western canon. And I think that if you take Nietzsche to its ultimate end, I think that you have this very great focus. Not actually, I don't think that Nietzsche is something that leads to fascism at all, but I do think that it is something that naturally leads to this tremendous opposition to equality, which I think is not in vogue in the modern day. That being said, I think that Martin Luther King is a part of the Western canon. And I think that ideologically, he fits perfectly into that. And I think that that's kind of what proves my point. The Western canon is producing things like this. It is producing freedom movements. And I think that it's interesting to see that some of the greatest movements of freedom are already produced by the Western canon. And I think that tells you a lot about why Western hegemony is not always bad.
So I'm interested in how the speaker, the gentleman, is going to draw the connection between the kind of material realities of Western hegemony, and this canon, this literary tradition? Like is your connection, is Western hegemony simply reduced to the fact that Aristotle appears on Botticelli? Or is there like an actual material reality to Western hegemony that is actually arguing against? And then I think that's from material foundation kind of economic strangulation.
The Western canon is probably what produces Western hegemony through another pretty important thing, which is the concept of, well, actually, it stems from the concept of individualism. I think that the concept of individualism necessarily begets a pretty capitalist economy, and while I think that capitalism has a hell of a lot of like bad things it does to populations, I will agree with the party of the left on this. I think at the end of the day, it's like much more efficient at producing like material wealth in a society, which will allow it to beat other societies. I think that there's a reason why industrialized societies beat unindustrialized societies in war. I think that that's why the West was able to conquer the world in the 19th century, and I think that it's curious that only pretty much capitalist in reality societies now, with China's economic reforms and with India becoming or undergoing more economic reforms, they're the only countries which are economically challenging the West right now. And I think that that's a sign of the fact that, yeah, you can buy guns with money, and basically that will lead to the West necessarily controlling everything until everyone else adopts that. That's actually bad, but...
It also seems like a lot of anti-capitalist thought has been produced in the West. Marx was in the West. Whether one wants to count him as part of the Western canon or not, how can a society and a tradition that is so based in individualism produce this kind of opposition to capitalism? And is this like evidence that either the Western canon is not inherently individualistic or that individualism does not necessarily lead to capitalism?
No, because I don't think that it's impossible to conceive of Marx not as an individualist, but as a product of a longer-term intellectual individualism. I think that the fact of the matter is that the Western canon, especially the basically Abrahamic tradition, puts this pretty special emphasis on, I'm not entirely sure how to phrase this, but like the like potential of every single person, and the fact that like every single person is endowed with some kind of like intrinsic personness, and I think that that bleeds very strongly into Marx. I think that Marx is someone who does believe like equality can be constructed from this idea that every single person has like some intrinsically valuable thing, but that intrinsically valuable thing is like going to be created by some form of very early individualism. So yeah, I think that the Western canon is branching off into different things now. It's like Latin, right? You get like Italian, and then you get like weird Latin. Other Romance, like French, right? It's so strange they're related, and yet they are. So yeah, capitalism, communism, they're both Western canon things.
A final question for Mr. Paduli, the floor leader of the left.
So, but isn't the Western canon kind of a bit arbitrary, right? If you're asking scholars in the 1960s whether they're including a letter from Birmingham jail in the Western canon, right, that's usually not going to be the case. These things are mostly constructed. It's also the case that certain works of the Western canon are read in a certain way that kind of fits this individualistic mindset. For example, the Bible very much espouses both in the Old and New Testament kind of a collectivist ethic. So like, can we truly put all of our weight behind something that is so artificially constructed?
If you accept that things are like gray and have blurred lines, no, the Western canon is not artificially constructed. Like, there are a lot of texts that are like quasi-Western, right? And taken, basically, you have like hybrid elements of the Western canon. And I think it's true to say that they, in some cases, are the greatest things that the West has ever influenced or come close to producing. But if we produce this like arbitrary distinction of like book by book, this is Western, this is not Western, this is Western, like, no, it's not gonna work. It's not gonna do anything. Like, you have to be willing to just use common sense here and say, okay, like, this seems to fit within some kind of Western tradition. Well, there are a lot of hisses for common sense. Honestly, not surprising in the YPU, to be honest. But yeah, just use common sense. It's like, it's not just a straight line between the two.
And with that, Mr. Paduli is thanked. Mr. Lee, the rebuttal.
Oh, I'm very glad I get to do one of these. Okay. Actually, I want to thank like Mr. Paduli for the speech he gave earlier, because like what he basically did is he basically self-derived like the Hegelian dialectic without calling it Hegel, right? Like, there's this self-referential canon that is very individualistic and kind of deterministic, and then like we follow that canon to its logical conclusion. Oh, and now we're talking about Marx. I wonder why, right? Like this is Hegel. What is the problem with this? Okay, there's like a number of problems with this. The first and probably the most important thing that I need to talk about is the fact that like the Western canon that like Mr. Paduli described is consistent. Like the Hegelian dialectic is consistent. That's why when we talk about Hegel, we're obviously talking about him inside of the dialectic, so we can't escape. Right? This is the great Hegelian question. The problem is that the Hegelian dialectic doesn't, frankly speaking, doesn't contain virtues that are like fundamentally Eastern outside the Western canon, and that like things that frankly we should still consider part of a good society. Things like harmony. I don't know, things like communal prosperity. Like things like that. I'm not saying communal prosperity in the Marxist sense, Mr. Chan. You should calm down. But the point being, like, the Western canon is consistent. That doesn't mean it's a sufficient condition. The Western canon is insufficient, and frankly, like, this puts me into the negative resolution, even though I didn't start out this way. Are you have questions?
Is there a question from the much maligned?
Yeah.
The question.
The gentleman's speech confused me, partly because I couldn't hear a little bit. So I'm not going to make my question, can he repeat it? Because that would be sad. But I will make my question more pointed. Why does it have to be like so dialectical? And why does it have to be able to like I don't understand why it has to be like that, and why you don't see the possibility of it producing more and more different kinds of canons. Like, why is that so difficult to conceive of?
Canon, we're talking about like a historical body of text. Something like Confucius will probably never be part of the Western canon because it didn't originate in the West.
And with that.
I don't.
And with that, Mr. Lee is thanked. Is there now a third speech in the affirmative? The speech is Neubauer.
When the Spaniards arrived in South America hundreds of years ago, they came and they brought images of the Virgin Mary, and they went to all of the indigenous like artists. They were like, you have to learn how to paint this. You have to they tried to convert them. They said here you have to paint our idol. You have to paint our not idol. But you have to paint the image of our sacred text, whatever. And so, as a part of the process of hybridity and mixing of cultures, indigenous artists kind of incorporated glyphs of the Virgin Mary into their art, and they did this in their style, in that it didn't serve as an icon of the Virgin Mary. It served as a glyph that related to the Virgin Mary, and the Spaniards, they looked at it and they said, these guys suck at art. They can't draw. Why can't they paint like our people can paint? They're terrible at art. They must be worse than us. They have no, And the reason I say this is because they're judging indigenous artists by the standards of their Western canon of art. And the problem with this conception of the Western canon of art, and I wasn't going to talk about art, but then Mr. Paduli brought up art, and so I had to. I was really trying to avoid it. But the thing about the Western canon of art is that the Western canon of art, of literature, of everything, is directly in response to itself. So Hegel is Hegel you know, because of all the people who came before it. What was it, Kant, who said that Hume awoke him from his slumber? Like, all of these authors and artists are directly responding to each other. The Western canon is like so not individual. The Western canon is a body that exists only in response to itself, in response to people who came before, and so that people of the future can then build on it. And this is precisely why it's not worth like being the hegemon, because we can't be judging the merits of the works of other cultures when they haven't had act on by the merits, but by the standards that we judge the Western canon, because the Western canon had centuries of like self-referential creation in order to build and say, this is what makes good art. And in like 1600s Peru, something else made good art. And they brought their own standards and they said, why aren't you good at this? You guys are terrible. And like, no, because they had their own standards, they had their own merits. We can't apply, you know, like, we can't apply like Western methodology to art that didn't know that it was supposed to be judged by that metric. There are so many different types of creations in the world, and all of them are being judged by only the merits that they know of. And when we think about, you know, as the guest was saying, like, Western hegemony is built on the supposed superiority of Western knowledge. But Western knowledge created that for itself. Like, the East, like, countries in Asia and South America didn't know that they were supposed to be conforming to this standard, so how are we going to judge them by it? And the point is not that, like, the West gave us individualism and individualism is good. The point is that the West, A, doesn't really exist, as I think Mr. Agarwal touched on, and B, is no better than any other culture. It has just better defined its standards by the fact that we know about them in a bastion of Western hegemony in this university. Like, it is just more self-referential and is better at defining its terms. It does not mean that it is better. It just means that we know more about what the West says makes itself good. I yield to questions.
The question from the guest.
Great, thank you for the speech, and I'd like to ask two questions. One is, how strongly do you want to hold on to the self-referential character of it? So, two, I wonder, in a kind of contemporary global world where there's a kind of integrated art market, for instance, how should we imagine the criteria of judgment for arts?
Yeah, thank you. So I think to answer the first part of the guest's question, another really, but probably my favorite line in all of Edward Said's Orientalism, which I read like 3/4 of for a class 2 years ago, is that the West defines, like the West defines itself in opposition to the world, but like that really the West defines the East in order to define itself. That the West wants to say, like, we are the West, we are superior. That the West wants to be big and strong and say, here we are the best. And in order to do that, you need an enemy, you need an opposition. And so the West creates the East. It creates the non-West, which like we include South America, which is not in the East. That it's clearly not about geography. It's about opposition. It's about creating an other so that we can be the best. And so I do think that it's very self-referential in that, like, the other that it creates is so that it can further reference itself. And I think onto the second part, in a global art market, like, yes, it is true that we don't have like the Prix de Rome to define who is the best French artist anymore, and I think that's good. I think that one of the really great things about the global art market, and there are a lot of really bad things about it, but one of the good things is that there are different types of art, there are different tastes, and people making different things can be successful. Like, I think that Damien Hirst's like stuffed shark in gelatin is like the worst thing to ever happen to art, and it's sold for $20 million. But like, I think that it's good that somebody making something that I don't like can be successful. Like, no individual person or culture should be the arbiter of what is good. And so I think that the more types of art that is available, the more ways that we can say that this is good, the better. And we live in a global society, and that's what it has to be.
Further questions?
Ooh, that was unpopular.
Further questions for Ms. Neubauer. Ms. Bargava.
Why is it incorrect for the Western canon to be self-referential? As a student of philosophy, I actually find it to be... As a student of engineering and philosophy, I find it to be incredibly useful when the Western canon makes references to itself and enables me to further explore the canon rather than a very disintegrated canon such as certain parts of the Indian canon. Along the same lines, the Western canon, especially the art and the philosophy sections of the Western canon, are more readily accessible and available for people to read and consume because they have been thought about, critiqued, and translated over and over and over again. So why is it incorrect for the Western canon to be self-referential and to be as widely available as something that inspires people to be philosophical or artistic?
I don't think that it's incorrect. I don't think I think that that is what makes Western hegemony and the Western canon such an enduring concept, is that it does have this power where I can say, oh, I read, Aquinas, and he quotes this guy, so that I should go back and read this one, and then Aristotle quotes Plato, so I should read Plato. Like, that is what I think gives it such this enduring power. But I think that to the second part of the question, I don't think it's incorrect. I think that that is what makes it what it is. But onto this, the second part of the lady's question is, yes, it's great that that we all have access to all of these texts and all of these great works of art, but it is a problem that the most accessible works of art are all from this canon. It is designed that way. It is designed to be self-referential, so I can go down the Western canon, I can take DS and say, I learned all of literature, I did it. I learned philosophy. But that's not true. It's designed to be insular so that we can ignore everything else. But what we really need to be doing is, and I fully believe this, I don't think that we should be burning all of French portraiture. I think that we should be, because it represents empire or Napoleon or domineering, I think that we should be working really, really hard and making a concerted effort to make texts and art from other places more accessible. Everybody who wants to read philosophy should be just as, able to read Confucius as Aristotle. And I know that Confucius is pretty readily available. I'm no philosophy expert, but we should be able to read non-Western philosophy just as we should be able to read Western philosophy. And then once we can do that, we can then work to draw connections between them that may not be evident to us because we haven't studied them and they're not easy to access for us.
For dichotomy, a round smiling Buddha or a scrawny Pieta?
The latter?
I'm interested in the idea of Western judgment of indigenous art, right? I'm reading Blues People by Amiri Baraka, in which he goes into this discussion of how indigenous and African arts and works of art are treated less as things worthy of appreciation and more as artifacts, right? So how do we meaningfully go, when you go to the UAG, or you go to the Louvre, or you go to any museum ever, right? You have it separated by contemporary American, 18th century German, 18th century French, and then you just have African and East Asian or whatever, right? It's very obviously focused on this idea of the West. How do we go from classifying these non-Western objects as artifacts and more towards appreciating them as useful and aesthetically like important works of art?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and that is like one of the biggest questions facing like art history and museum studies today. And I think that basically I have all the answers to every problem in the world. But like the answer to this problem, and I'm not an expert on like indigenous art or anything like that, but I think that the key to this is thinking about methodology. So for most of art history, since Vasari's Lives of the Artists, art historians have been saying like, in order to determine how good a piece of art is, we look at these things, we look at these formal features, and then we look at the artist's background, and we look at his life, and then we say, oh, he went to this school, and he was a genius at age 7, and like, you know, he studied under this person, and because he studied under this person, he's better than somebody who studied under that person. And there's this like very strict method in art history of like categorization and iconography, like Erwin Panofsky's matters about a piece of art is what we can see. And what I can see, I see this and it represents that. I look at Manet's Olympia, the cat represents like promiscuity. The nakedness represents this. The flowers represent that. And I think that the biggest issue is that we've taken it to heart that unless I can analyze a piece of art and say this is what every single object in this painting means, that unless I can do that, then it's bad. And the truth is that most art, again, like I said, non-Western artists did not create art with these standards in mind. And so we can't apply the same methodologies to non-Western art as we can to Western art. So when we look at, you know, indigenous African art, I was there in art over class where it talks about like in certain like forms of art, like the placement of a statue in a home changes its meaning. And what matters is who made it and how a leader in the tribe blessed it. Like that there are many ways that art has meaning outside of like its formal features and what those features represent. And so I think that in order to, I guess, stop saying like anything from Africa is an artifact, which is a huge problem, that we have to start re-examining how we examine art and how we analyze art and try to break down and say, okay, this artist was not trying to conform with these standards, so we should not be judging them based on these standards that they didn't even know existed and don't care about.
And with that, Ms. Neubauer is thanked.
I think we seem to have gotten like a tiny bit derailed here. So, the infantilizing opinion that is given to people who are colonized people and are going through this process of postcolonialism is something that has been repeated over and over and over again. There's a reason why we're debating resolve to end Western hegemony. The West has gotten a bad rep for a very good reason, and it's about racism. It is about denying people the right to vote based on the assumption, not that like rights or things, but basically just because of their race, because of their culture, people are not allowed or don't have the ability to do self-government. So I don't contest any of the things that are said about how bad Western hegemony has been for people. I also don't contest the idea that like having hierarchies of power is in general not like the best thing in the world. But I do think that there is like the implicit end goal of something like ending Western hegemony that needs to be questioned a little bit further. And generally, what is taken to be the ideal end goal is the antithesis of this. So what is it to say that somebody is actually capable of like rejecting an empire? That is a world of pure self-governance, of a collection of nation-states comprised of complete sovereignty in and of themselves, that they can dictate their own internal political matters however they see fit without interference from other individuals and other nations whatsoever. And I think that this is a really great utopia, but I don't think that this utopia can exist. And I don't think that this utopia can exist for a number of reasons. First is trade. Right, we have a couple of layers that we have Western hegemony on. It's about politics, it's about the military, it's about economics, and it's culture. These are all three very different forms of sovereignty. All of them are very related. It's about who are a people, how do people make decisions, how do people have power over their own lives. And I think these are all very, very important. And yet we are unable to extricate ourselves now from the emerging globalized world. Even though we see a more nationalistic backlash happening across the globe today, I don't think that this is sustainable simply because countries can't be self-sufficient in the way that they want to be in order to be completely sovereign in the ideas that they have. Beyond that, we live in a world that is facing so many climate issues that this is going to necessitate people working together. And if I do concede that when we have a federal government, this is a breach of sovereignty. This is something that is not a bunch of people, a bunch of nations co-equally getting together and making decisions. Third is that nations, nationality, and international affairs is in and of itself an intersubjective measure. Self-determination contains within itself the language for its own defeat. That is, who are the people who are self-determining? If we think about Quebec, if we think about Catalonia, we think about a lot of other countries in which people want to have their own political unit. The question is why and for whom, and why is this legitimate in the first place? We want to have self-determination as an answer for legitimacy, but it does not provide us such an answer. And even when people revolt, even when people declare themselves against their empirical overlords, what you need to have in order to be a self-determining and sovereign nation is international recognition. And that in and of itself is power that is given to nations outside yourself, to people outside yourself. At the end of the day, though, even if we had a League of Nations where every country had their own vote, we are not actually going to be able to escape the kinds of political issues that we want to within our utopia. We can see this within the federal government of the United States of America because we have a part of our Constitution that guarantees that states will be equal sovereigns. And yet we have seen so many issues across the years wherein new states have not been recognized or allowed to join the United States of America, not because they lack the population requirement, but because they would or would not allow slavery. We also see gerrymandering and many other issues that show us that even when we have co-equal sovereigns, even when we have one person, one vote, we still have politics, we still have issues within power structures, and we haven't been able to eradicate the issues that we want to solve with self-determination. The answer to this is not to aspire to this utopia that cannot exist, but to radically rethink what we mean when we say we want a world of self-determining sovereigns. Sovereignty has to be something that does not have...
The motion.
For a motion. I move that we allow Ms. Garber 30 seconds to wrap up her remarks.
30 seconds, your time is so extended. Thank you, Madam Speaker. My last point is that I think sovereignty and self-determination have to be rethought.
Autonomy, the president. Domination, culture, science, religion.
Religion.
Hot take. Is there a question for the guest?
Yes, thank you for the speech. I want to ask, I'm not sure why why we would think that the ending of Western hegemony necessitates the kind of linking of self-determination with sovereign nation states, right? It seems like, if we think that Western hegemony has persisted, it seems like it's quite capable of accommodating itself to a world of formally equal sovereign states as it has since post-World War II. So I just wonder why it is that, foregoing a vision of Western hegemony will lead us down a path in which our only option is the self-determining sovereign nation state.
I'm mostly basing this, I think, off of, for example, Simón Bolívar. Oftentimes the articulations of what are the alternatives to Western hegemony are the idea of, for example, the League of Nations, a collection of nation states that have been sovereign. I think that this is probably the most politically acceptable idea other than Western hegemony. I just don't necessarily think that it has the answers to everything that it wants.
Further questions for Ms.
So is the ladies' model for a successful system the European Union?
Not particularly. Mostly because I want to maintain some semblance of like identity within it, and I think that the European Union creates economic linkages that end up creating a melding of identities over time. It'll take like a couple of decades, maybe a century, maybe two, I don't know. But like, I don't really particularly want to put us down a path that's eventually going to end up in a world state.
Thank you for indulgence, Madam Speaker. So we've had this argument many times in the past, but the lady seems to give the argument in which that like small states just simply cannot exist today. Either they exist in large multicultural nations like the United States, European Union, China, in which they have the market power, military force, and like diplomatic clout to exist and remain sovereign, or they exist in the periphery of large nations that require market access, protection, and whatnot to these larger states. And either they become culturally subsumed by these larger states, or like don't exist anymore. So in this kind of world, like, can sovereignty exist for smaller cultures if only the larger states have the power to truly play in the sandbox?
One of my speech is that like the idea of sovereignty in and of itself is fundamentally flawed, right? And so for me, I think that the most important thing is to preserve some semblance of cultural knowledge to go back to our arts aspects of this. Which also implicates things about science and medicine, et cetera, et cetera. But pure sovereignty in the way that I think Mr. G means it is not something that is like particularly important to me.
And with that, Ms. Starbird is thanked. Seeing the growing lateness of the hour, is there perhaps an appropriate motion? Mix Pergola.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I move the previous question.
Hearing seconds, it is so moved. Are there now closing remarks from the guest? Thank you.
I want to just group my concluding remarks into two buckets. So the first is, I was struck over the course of our conversation how the debate about Western hegemony writ large turned into a debate about the Western canon. I think, given our specific context in a university and the various debates that have happened over the last decade around curricula, decolonizing the university, etc., it's not surprising that that would have happened. So I want to say just two things about the so-called Western canon, which I teach a lot as a political theorist. One, I think it's worth thinking about what were the conditions of possibility for the emergence of modern liberal thought. We've talked a bit about ideas of liberty, individual liberty, right? Democratic self-government had their high points in, of course, or their inauguration in the French Revolution. I would argue, and this is really based on the tradition I study, the tradition of Black political thought, that the conditions of possibility for those ideas of freedom depended on the backdrop of slavery. The individual, rights-bearing subject, tied to property, depended on the figure of the slave. The rise of the bourgeoisie, the kind of agents, progenitors of the French Revolution, got their wealth on the transatlantic slave trade. So this is not to say that the tradition is morally bankrupt, but it is to say that the tradition was always embedded in and imbricated with the project and processes of European imperial expansion. Those who were the subjects of this process of imperial expansion did not always reject the canon. They did not always search for their own authentic indigenous traditions of pasts. What they also did is claim that the Western tradition was theirs too, because they had built the West. It was their labor, the fruits of their labor that built the Western world. So So what they did was they appropriated and radicalized the Western tradition. Figures like Neubauer and Frantz Fanon, the ways in which fascism had grown from the seeds of bourgeois society in Europe, but they called for the creation of a new humanism. They wanted to radicalize and universalize that project of humanism. So I think we should take this seriously as a way of thinking about our own relationship to our collective inheritance of the Western tradition. The second thing I would like to suggest is, and this is to do with the kind of, I guess, the material or political dimensions of Western hegemony, is the question of what the prospects and possibilities for alternatives to Western hegemony might be. Right? With the idea that self-rule, at least in my estimation, self-rule and visions of self-rule have to be at the center of any kind of imagination of an alternative to both the nation state and to empire. I think the other thing is we all have to take our conditions, our positions very seriously as either citizens or residents of the country that has been, and at least for now, continues to be the hegemon of the world. What does it mean for us to be the citizens, of this country? What might it look like for us to challenge from within what again King called the greatest purveyor of violence in the world? So with that, I just want to thank you very much for the opportunity to be in conversation.
We will now divide the body. If the floor leaders would come to the front and help me count. All those in the affirmative of the resolution resolved and Western hegemony, please raise your hands high. All those in the negative. All those abstaining. Justice. 1921, 2, motion fails. I move we make a guess. Second. Hearing seconds, she is so very, very thanked. Is there now a final motion? Mr. Saylor.
Thank you. I move we adjourn.
Second. Seconds, we are so adjourned.
You prepared a speech. Camilo gave a great take that formed this.
I saw him leaving the Tumblr, and I was like, I was really I'm not the most familiar with him. I think he's like,